Imagine being on a ship with no name, carrying cargo that could get you killed, sailing through waters patrolled by an enemy fleet with orders to sink anything suspicious on sight. Now imagine that before you ever left port, you sat through your own funeral while you were still alive, just in case. That wasn't a metaphor. That was standard procedure for the sailors of the Ho Chi Minh Trail at sea. Over 15 years, this fleet made nearly 2,000 voyages across some of the most heavily patrolled waters on Earth. Not one of their ships had a name, not one carried a registration number. And on the nights things went wrong, the crews didn't surrender. They blew up their own ships, with themselves still on board if they had to. This is the story of a navy that officially never existed. Most people who've heard of the Ho Chi Minh Trail picture a jungle path, weaving through Laos and Cambodia, bombed relentlessly for years by American aircraft. That trail was real, and it mattered enormously, but it wasn't the only road south. There was a second one, and it ran across open ocean, hiding not in the darkness of a rainforest canopy, but in plain sight, in the middle of some of the most heavily patrolled waters on Earth. To understand why that second road even needed to exist, you have to go back to the late 1950s, when the resistance in the south was desperately short of weapons, and the mountain trail through Laos alone couldn't move enough supplies fast enough. Someone in Hanoi looked at a map of the coastline and asked an obvious but audacious question. What if you skipped the 1,000 miles of jungle entirely and just sailed straight down? On paper, that idea was almost absurd. Vietnam had no real navy to speak of, certainly nothing that could challenge American warships in open water. There was no way to move weapons down the coast without being spotted eventually. And yet, in July of 1959, a small unit was quietly formed under the most unassuming cover imaginable, registered as something called the Song Jian Fishing Collective. On paper, they caught fish. In reality, they were laying the groundwork for one of the boldest logistics operations of the entire war. By October the 23rd, 1961, that quiet experiment had grown serious enough to become an official military unit, Group 759, the direct predecessor of what would later be known as Naval Brigade 125. Their mission was as simple to state as it was nearly impossible to execute. Move weapons from the north to the south, by sea, without ever letting the enemy know the route existed. Personally, I think this is one of the most audacious ideas of the entire war, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves next to the jungle trail. Because hiding in a forest is one thing, hiding on open water, where every ship is visible for miles and every horizon belongs to someone else's navy, is an entirely different order of difficulty. The first real test came on October the 16th, 1962. A vessel called Phuong Dong 1, under political officer Bong Van Dia and Captain Le Van Mot, carried 30 tons of weapons out of the north and delivered them safely to Rach Gok in Ca Mau province, at the very southern tip of the country. No enemy patrol intercepted them. No alarm was ever raised. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than a fishing boat returning from a long trip. That one quiet, uneventful voyage proved the entire concept could work. But therefore came the much harder question: how do you repeat that again and again for years without ever getting caught? The answer the crews settled on wasn't clever camouflage paint or some hidden compartment. It was something almost unbearably human. Before every single voyage, the sailors of Group 759 took part in a ceremony their commanders called the living funeral. Each man stood through a memorial service held for himself while he was still alive, still breathing, still standing right there in front of his own portrait and his own eulogy. It wasn't superstition, it was preparation. Every sailor who stepped onto one of those ships accepted, in advance, that if the mission was ever compromised, there would be no capture, no negotiation, no surrender. There would only be the order to destroy the ship and, if necessary, to go down with it. Try to sit with that for a moment. These weren't professional commandos trained for a suicide mission. Many of them were fishermen, mechanics, young men barely out of their teens, and yet they walked, willingly, into a job where the last item on the checklist, every single time, was their own possible death, and they did it without being ordered to feel brave about it. They simply accepted it as the cost of the work. No professional navy anywhere in the world has ever asked that level of commitment from ordinary sailors as a standing condition of the job, and yet here, it was simply how the work got done. For the first few years, the gamble paid off spectacularly. Ship after ship slipped down the coast, disguised as fishing boats, blending into the hundreds of legitimate vessels that worked those same waters every day. Weapons reached the south, the resistance grew stronger, and the enemy, for a long time, suspected something was happening, but had no proof. That changed on the morning of February the 16th, 1965. A medevac pilot, flying a routine run from Quy Nhon to Nha Trang, crossed over a stretch of coastline called Vung Rho. Something on the cliffside caught his eye, an odd outcrop of rock jutting out from the hillside that he didn't remember ever seeing before. He radioed it in, almost as an afterthought. Within an hour, a reconnaissance plane was overhead, photographing what turned out to be a heavily camouflaged pier, and beside it, a vessel called C-143, still in the process of unloading 63 tons of weapons. The ship's crew, 18 men under Captain Lavan Them, tried to do exactly what they'd been trained for. They rigged 500 kilograms of explosives and attempted to blow the hull apart before it could be captured intact. But therefore, in the panic and confusion, they couldn't reach the engine compartment in time, and when the charge went off, the ship split in half instead of vanishing entirely. What followed was over a week of fighting up and down that stretch of coast, as South Vietnamese and American forces tried to fully secure the wreckage and the evidence around it. Vung Rho was, without question, a serious loss. But it was also something else. It was undeniable proof, sitting right there on the beach, of exactly what American intelligence had suspected for years but had never been able to confirm. One U.S. Navy captain, R. Sorhesley, later put it plainly in his own writing. The Vung Rho incident confirmed something that had long been suspected but never proven. Within weeks, the United States launched Operation Market Time, a coordinated barrier of American and South Vietnamese naval patrols meant to seal off the entire Vietnamese coastline. The secret was out, and by any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the sea route. It wasn't. Here's the part of this story that I find genuinely remarkable every time I go back to it. Instead of abandoning the route, the crews of Group 759 adapted to a threat that was now watching them by name. Ships were redisguised, no longer as simple Vietnamese fishing boats, but as foreign commercial vessels, flying flags of countries thousands of miles away, running routes that took them far out into international waters before ever turning back toward the coast. American reconnaissance planes would circle overhead for hours at a time, sometimes flying low enough to look directly down onto the deck. At night, warships would trail alongside, running with their own lights on, daring the smaller vessel to make a mistake. And the policy governing all of it on the American and South Vietnamese side was blunt to the point of brutality. Better to strike the wrong target than to let a real one slip through. Sailing through that, night after night, for years, wasn't just a matter of skill. It was a matter of nerve that very few navies anywhere in the world have ever had to sustain for so long. This wasn't luck holding the route together after Vung Rho. It was proof that this fleet could absorb its worst possible exposure and rebuild itself into something even harder to catch, within weeks, while still under fire. By 1968, the crews making these runs had been living inside that pressure for nearly 7 years. Nguyen Phan Vinh, the young captain of vessel C-235, had spent 15 straight days and nights rehearsing 3 separate combat contingencies with his crew before they ever left port at a naval base known as Ben Bin in Haiphong. He wasn't hoping he'd never need those plans. He was making sure that if the night came, his crew would already know exactly what to do without a second of hesitation. The ship left port on February the 27th, carrying 14 tons of weapons meant for the Tet Offensive campaign, then raging across the south. 2 nights later, as C-235 changed course toward the waters off Con Hoa province, it was spotted. 7 enemy warships moved to encircle it. Overhead, helicopters dropped flares that lit the whole bay white, then opened fire with rockets. Vinh didn't try to outrun them in open water. He knew that was hopeless against 7 ships. Instead, he pushed the vessel in close to shore, toward a stretch of coast called Hon Heo, one so treacherous with hidden reefs and narrow channels that French naval records from decades earlier claimed it took 20 years of experience to navigate it safely at night without running aground. Vinh took his ship in anyway, in the dark, under fire, and made it work. For hours, C-235 fought back, maneuvering, returning fire, buying time to unload as many weapons ashore as they could manage before the end came. But the enemy had firepower and numbers that simply couldn't be matched forever. When Vinh finally understood there was no way to break through the encirclement, he made the call the crew had trained for since that first living funeral years earlier: destroy the ship. He didn't give that order carelessly. First, he made sure the wounded and the dead were carried ashore to the base of the cliffs. In the middle of the most violent moments of his own life, his last clear-headed decision wasn't about saving himself. It was about making sure every man who could still be saved was. Only then, with his engineer, a warrant officer named No Van Thu, did he go back one last time to check the detonator himself, making absolutely certain it would work. When they saw their surviving crewmates had reached the rocks safely, the two men slipped into the water and began swimming for shore. The explosion that followed lit up the entire bay. 14 of the 21 crew members of C-235 died that night, including Nguyen Phan Vinh himself, 35 years old, and No Van Thu beside him. Here's the detail that, to me, says more about what actually happened that night than any casualty count could. A South Vietnamese naval magazine called Luat Song, writing about the battle afterward, from the other side of the war entirely, described facing what they believed was an entire enemy battalion, backed by 12 warships and dozens of smaller patrol boats with air support overhead. In reality, the force they were describing with such alarm was 20 sailors on a single cargo ship. The magazine's own account admitted those 20 men fought to their last bullet and to the very last man, then destroyed their own vessel rather than let a single crate of it fall into enemy hands, leaving behind, in the magazine's own words, not a single trace. Read that again. This wasn't a Vietnamese source inflating its own legend. This was the enemy's own press, trying to explain to their own readers how 12 warships and a battalion's worth of firepower had been fought to a standstill for hours by a crew smaller than a single infantry platoon. This is not Vietnam telling you how brave its sailors were. This is the enemy, in its own newspaper, unable to hide it. That's not propaganda. That's an empire, in its own words, admitting it never fully understood what it was up against. And Nguyen Phan Vinh's ship wasn't the only one paying that price during those same weeks. Vessel 165, running supplies into the waters off Ca Mau during that same Tet offensive, was surrounded by 12 American warships. Its crew fought back exactly as they'd been trained to, then destroyed their own ship rather than surrender it. 18 more sailors were killed. Multiply that kind of night by nearly 2,000 voyages, stretched across 15 years, from 1961 all the way to the fall of Saigon in 1975, and you start to understand the true scale of what this fleet actually accomplished. Over those 15 years, these ships carried more than 152,000 tons of weapons and supplies south, along with more than 80,000 soldiers and cadres. They survived more than 20 typhoons at sea. They fought more than 30 direct engagements with enemy warships. They weathered over 1,200 separate air attacks, and in the middle of all of that, still managed to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft. The combined routes they sailed, weaving across the open water to avoid detection, added up to nearly 12,000 nautical miles, more than 22,000 kilometers, roughly half the circumference of the entire planet. And for most of that time, not one enemy patrol, not one American admiral, not one intelligence officer back in Washington could say with certainty exactly how this was still happening. I think that's the detail worth sitting with longest. This wasn't a fleet of warships built to win a naval battle in the conventional sense. It was never meant to sink an aircraft carrier or hold a piece of ocean by force. Its entire purpose was to disappear, again and again, into waters that belonged, on paper, to someone else's navy entirely, and to keep disappearing until the job was done, no matter what that cost the men doing it. In 1970, Nguyen Phan Vinh was posthumously honored as a hero of the People's Armed Forces. 20 years later, in 1990, to mark the anniversary of the liberation of the Spratly Islands, one of those islands was officially renamed in his honor, Phan Vinh Island. A young captain who once commanded a ship with no number now has his name on a piece of Vietnamese territory that will outlast every warship that ever hunted him. That's the answer to the question this video opened with. A fleet with no name, no registration, no flag flying openly on its masts wasn't erased by that anonymity. It was protected by it, and in the end, remembered because of it. The ships themselves are gone, most of them at the bottom of the sea exactly where their crews meant them to be. But the vow those crews made before ever leaving port outlived every single empire that ever sailed out to hunt them down. If this story moved you the way the crew of C-235 moved me while I was researching it, let me know in the comments which detail hit you hardest, the living funeral held before every voyage, or the enemy's own account of 20 sailors fighting off an entire naval task force. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story on History of Vietnam, where we uncover the people history almost forgot.